Okay, on the 26th of October, just passed at 3 o'clock, it just finished the final session of the Gaza Tribunal. And I am asking one of the key organizers and intellectuals of the Tribunal Organizing Committee, Professor Penny Green. Penny, your thoughts on all the tribunals that culminated in today's final declaration?
Oh, thank you. I think what was so important was that the germination in this tribunal was heard around 18 months ago. And we had our first meeting in Myanmar, and then our first hearing, or our first session, formally in Sarajevo in May of 2025. And I think that what we saw in Sarajevo was the culmination of the work of three very important chambers. We had a chamber addressing the law, international law, and the crimes that were committed. We had a chamber addressing the geopolitical foundations of Israel's genocide against the Palestinians. And we had a chamber that addressed the historical, philosophical, sort of criminological underpinnings and ethical underpinnings of the genocide. So those chambers brought together both expert witnesses and those who were witnesses on the ground in Palestine, in Gaza in particular. And I think that what we did in Sarajevo, very importantly, was to lay the foundations for understanding every nuanced aspect of this horrendous genocide. We then produced the Sarajevo Declaration, which, if you like, harnessed our commitment to documenting the genocide, to taking forward all actions we can in terms of invigorating the solidarity movement around the world in order to do everything it can to intervene in this continuing genocide. Because, of course, today we've talked at the final hearing, the final session in Istanbul of the Gaza Tribunal, where we've heard over the course of 4 days tremendously powerful witness testimony from Gaza, from the West Bank. We've heard experts giving evidence on the Gaza side on its targeting of medical care and medical personnel. We heard a tremendous array of information relating to all the complex aspects of this genocide. And we heard from courageous voices of global solidarity who are taking individual actions against Israeli genocide, against the state of Israel, against the complicit states that are involved in this genocide, and particularly the United States of America, but not excluding the United Kingdom, Germans, France, but the Netherlands, Belgium, those countries in the European Union that continue to sell weapons parts to Israel, the parts that are then used in the annihilation of men, women, and children in the Gaza Strip. And let's not forget that we have a ceasefire, but that ceasefire is not holding. Israel has broken the ceasefire virtually immediately. People in the Gaza Strip are still being assassinated, murdered.
Yeah.
And so, I'm sorry. So today, I think we have, we heard from our jury of conscience a really marvelous statement which addressed all of the crimes that are embodied in this genocide. And there are multitude crimes embodied in this genocide. And we've heard about the way in which we seek to invigorate and animate further actions within the global solidarity movement. And one of the things that we've heard over the past 4 days, testimony from people who were involved in the Global Samud Flotilla, people involved in the Hind Rajab Foundation, Palestinians who are working on the trying to understand and to represent the prisoners, the 10,000 prisoners that Israel has incarcerated are very often simply under military war, under military law. And we've heard from all manner of, all elements of global civil society who are combining to tackle this egregious genocide and those who are committing it.
Yeah. Final the question. Beyond Gaza, um, Professor Richard Falk, the chair of the tribunal, in his closing remark, repeatedly invoked colonialism. Um, can you care to comment on the colonial nature of this genocide, and if you see any linkages between what had transpired in the non-Western world over the last centuries with what we are witnessing today in Gaza?
I think that the impact of colonialism is profound in this genocide and in most genocides, quite frankly. So, what we see with Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people, which I would argue began in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, where Britain, as a colonial power, basically gave the land of Palestine, which was populated with Palestinian peoples, to European Zionists who were searching for a homeland. I think that's where we see the roots of the colonial occupation of Palestine. And then we have the Zionist settler colonial movement, which basically has been the driving force for this genocide. You know, the settler colonial goal is the elimination of the indigenous population, i.e. the Palestinian people, in order to establish a Jewish supremacist state, a Zionist supremacist state inside tradition Palestine. And that means that can really only be achieved once Palestine is free of Palestinians. That, from the perspective of this Israeli regime, that is what it requires in order to achieve its fundamental organizational goal of a Zionist supremacist state. Now, I do see very strong parallels. There are significant differences, but there are strong parallels between the genocide of the Palestinians by Israel and let's say the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Again, we see the role of colonialism at work historically, the British colonialism, which divided populations, which privileged certain populations, people from the Indian subcontinent, in the case of Myanmar, against the Burmese, particularly in states like Rakhine State. And so colonialism sowed the seeds for dissent. And I think that that's what has played out over the years, despite the fact that the UK plays far less of a role in Burma these days. But if you like, the neo-colonial practice of the regime that currently, the Houthi that operates inside Myanmar, is trying to again expel the indigenous Rohingya from their lands. As we know, in 2017, 2016, 2017, an egregious and violent military operation forced around 800,000 Rohingya from Rakhine State across the border into camps in Bangladesh, where we had about 1.2 million Rohingya languishing in very, very difficult conditions. And so that was, if you like, the annihilation phase of the genocide. But genocide, that is only one phase. Genocide begins with practices of dehumanization. And as I mentioned with the Balfour Declaration, that was no greater act of dehumanization than giving away the land of Palestine to European Zionists. And again, the idea in Rakhine State is that a Buddhist Burma supremacist state emerges, but it requires the removal of a troublesome population, a Muslim population that is seen to somehow threaten, or at least it is cultivated as threatening, other populations inside Rakhine State, other Burmese populations inside Rakhine State. So yes, there are always parallels with genocide, and genocides begin really with practices of dehumanization and stigmatization, moves into examples of sporadic violence, and once that violence gets a green light, as it did in Rakhine State with the Rohingya in 2012, and with Palestinians for many, many decades, that violence continues and it is amplified. And violence often leads to segregation. So it's very clear the apartheid segregation we see in the West Bank and in Gaza. In Rakhine State, it was equally so. After 2012, Rohingya were forced into camps, into prison villages, into a ghetto in the capital Sittwe in Rakhine State, or they lived largely in northern Rakhine State, which was something of a black hole in terms of accessibility. So we have that moment of segregation, and once people are segregated, it's very easy to systematically weaken them. You can reduce their food intake, you can reduce their calorific intake, you can reduce their access to basic human rights, you can reduce their access to education, you can reduce their access to healthcare. We saw all of this in Myanmar, in the camps, and we've seen it in Gaza par excellence. Once we have this situation of systematic weakening, a population is very hard to mass annihilation. And when a state decides it's time to up the ante for whatever reason has prompted it, then when you see the kind of annihilation witnessed in Gaza over the past 2 years. But we have to remember that this is simply the genocide. The genocide began much, much earlier, and it hasn't ended with a ceasefire. It will continue while Israel retains its commitment to its Zionist supremacist goal.